In the summer of 1991, the Indian government quietly initiated what was basically a highly classified logistical operation.
Right.
Over several weeks, heavily guarded trucks moved about 67 tons of national gold reserves from the vaults of the Reserve Bank of India to, chartered airplanes sitting on the tarmac.
Yeah, it's a crazy visual.
And those planes then flew to London and Tokyo.
Yeah.
And the thing is, it wasn't a heist. It was this desperate, visceral, essentially a pawn shop transaction by a sovereign nation.
Exactly.
The government literally had to pledge the physical family gold to the Bank of England and the Union Bank of Switzerland just to secure emergency financing. Because without it, the world's largest democracy would have defaulted on its sovereign debt in less than 14 days. The lights were quite literally about to go out.
It's really the absolute defining trauma of modern Indian economic history.
Yeah.
When an economy fractures to that degree, the symptoms aren't just, hidden in balance sheets anymore. They manifest in cargo planes full of bullion. And understanding the mechanics of how a nation gets to that breaking point and how it claws its way out requires looking past the surface level events. You have to look into the deep structural architecture of its policies.
Which is exactly why we are here today. Welcome to this custom deep dive, engineered specifically for you, the dedicated master's student gearing up for the IES General Economics GE-04 Paper 4 exam.
We know what you're facing.
We do. The stakes are high, the syllabus is vast, and the examiners, well, they aren't looking for Wikipedia summaries. They want to see your analytical teeth. So to set our agenda, we are dropping two heavy-hitting past questions right out of the gate. First, the 2025 IES question, asking you to evaluate the macroeconomic factors that prompted the 1991 Structural Adjustment Program.
Right.
And second, the 2024 question, asking for an evaluation of the roadmap to Viksit Bharat 2047.
And those questions, they really demand a rigorous framework. If you just list the policies, like if you just say, India liberalized in 1991 or India wants to be a $5 trillion economy, you will lose crucial marks.
Definitely.
You have to aggressively evaluate the structural transitions. You need to demonstrate why a specific policy architecture was chosen, how its internal mechanisms functioned or, failed, and what the unintended consequences were.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission for this deep dive is a rapid-fire, intensive, structural revision. We're going to rip through the syllabus by evaluating three critical domains. First, development planning history. How did the ideological choices of the 1950s mathematically guarantee the crisis of 1991? Second, industry in India. How did we pivot from obsessively protecting domestic firms to trying to forge global manufacturing champions? And third, foreign trade and WTO obligations. Like, how does a massive, complex domestic economy actually negotiate its survival and growth in a globalized trade regime?
And as you listen, you really need to recognize that these aren't isolated chapters in a textbook. They are interconnected gears in the same machine.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
The industrial policy chosen in the 1950s dictated the catastrophic trade outcomes of the 1980s, which then forced the structural adjustments of the 1990s, which in turn birthed the specific vulnerabilities we're trying to solve today with policies like the PLI scheme. You really have to trace that line of economic causality.
Well, let's trace that first line right now. We have to go back to the pre-1991 era. We're talking about the Nehruvian mixed economy and the famous Feldman-Mahalanobis model that anchored the second five-year plan.
Right, the classic starting point.
Yeah, the standard narrative is that it was an era of heavy industry bias and import substitution industrialization, ISI. But I want to push past just the definitions. Why did highly educated planners intentionally choose to choke off consumer goods imports and just pour massive public capital into steel and coal? What were they seeing in the global data that made them think this was the right mathematical move?
Well, to understand the Mahalanobis model, you really have to understand the prevailing development economics of the 1950s, specifically the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis.
Okay.
There was this deep-seated export pessimism. Indian planners looked at the global market and concluded that if a developing nation only exported primary agricultural commodities and imported manufactured goods, its terms of trade would secularly decline over time.
Right.
Basically, the global north would continuously capture all the value.
Because, the price of raw cotton falls, while the price of the British textile loom made from that cotton goes up. So you are forever running on a treadmill just to stand still.
Precisely. So the structuralist logic of the Mahalanobis model was to forcefully break that cycle. The strategy was to build the machines that make machines.
Yeah.
If you have a highly constrained pool of domestic savings and you just blow it all on importing consumer goods or light machinery for immediate consumption, you remain dependent. By channeling capital allocation aggressively into heavy capital goods, steel, power, heavy engineering, under the strict control of the public sector, the goal was long-term sovereign self-reliance. Consumer goods were actively restricted and, well, largely left to the highly inefficient, unmechanized small-scale sector.
And the intent there makes logical sense in a post-colonial vacuum, right?
Yeah.
But when we evaluate the execution for the exam, we have to look at the mechanisms of failure.
Absolutely.
To protect these new state-funded heavy industries, the government didn't just support them, it basically sealed them inside a fortress.
Right.
We saw tariff walls hit 300%, and there were physical quantitative restrictions on almost all imports. And this morphed into the notorious license permit quota raj.
Yeah, the raw.
Walk us through the actual mechanical friction of this system. Like, how did it choke the growth it was meant to foster?
The defining legislative tools here were the Industries Development and Regulation Act of 1951 and later the Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices Act, the MRTP Act. The mechanism was just total bureaucratic control over private capital formation. If you were a private textile manufacturer and you wanted to import a new, more efficient loom, or even just expand your current factory's capacity by 10% to meet rising demand, you couldn't just do it.
You had to file a petition with a centralized planning committee in New Delhi, wait, like 3 years, and prove that your expansion wouldn't harm a smaller competitor or violate some arbitrary capacity quota.
Yes. And what this did was structurally suppress economies of scale.
Right.
By legally penalizing expansion to prevent monopolies, the state basically ensured that Indian firms remained artificially small and fragmented. Furthermore, because foreign competition was locked out by those 300% tariffs and domestic competition was locked down by capacity quotas, there was zero incentive for a firm to minimize costs or upgrade technology.
Wow.
This is the textbook definition of X-inefficiency.
Yeah.
A firm operating under the license Raj had high bloated cost curves because survival depended on navigating the bureaucracy to secure a license, not on innovating on the factory floor.
I get that the outcomes were disastrous, resulting in what economists famously termed the Hindu rate of growth, that stagnant, 3.5% annual growth, while East Asia was sprinting ahead at 8%.
Yeah, roughly 3.5.
But surely the bureaucrats in the 70s and 80s weren't trying to maliciously ruin the economy? They had data. Why did they hold on to this model for so long?
Because they were operating within a paradigm of managing severe scarcity. When foreign exchange is inherently scarce because you aren't exporting anything competitive, every single dollar spent on imports feels like a loss of sovereign capability.
That makes sense.
The planners believed they were optimizing resource allocation. But by obsessively managing the scarcity, they institutionalized it.
Right.
They created a path dependency trap where millions of public sector jobs and the profit margins of politically connected private monopolists depended entirely on the continuation of those protectionist walls.
Which brings us to the breaking point and directly addresses the 2025 IES exam question, the macroeconomic factors prompting the 1991 crisis. We know about the gold airlift. The standard explanation is usually an exogenous shock like the Gulf War.
Yes.
But a sudden spike in oil prices doesn't bankrupt a healthy economy in a matter of months. There had to be an underlying structural rot that made the system so fragile. So let's evaluate the internal macroeconomic buildup to 1991.
The Gulf War was merely the spark. The internal macroeconomic imbalances were the highly combustible fuel. Throughout the 1980s, the Indian government engaged in massive fiscal profligacy.
Okay.
The combined fiscal deficit of the center and the states was hovering around an unsustainable 10% of GDP. And crucially, this wasn't borrowing for capital expenditure to build infrastructure.
Right. It wasn't productive.
Exactly. The government was borrowing to fund current, everyday consumption subsidies, administrative salaries, and mounting interest payments.
So it's essentially taking out a high-interest payday loan just to cover your monthly grocery and rent bills.
It's the classic twin deficit problem. When the government runs a massive fiscal deficit, it sucks up domestic savings. This excess domestic demand spills over into the external sector, driving up imports. Consequently, the current account deficit, the CAD, ballooned to over 3% of GDP by the late 80s. To finance this widening CAD, the government increasingly relied on short-term external commercial borrowing and deposits from non-resident Indians. We were borrowing short-term, volatile global capital to finance long-term, unproductive domestic consumption.
That is a terrifying balance sheet mismatch.
Yeah.
And then the exogenous shock actually hits. Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait in August 1990. How does the math of the crisis accelerate from there?
It was a devastating, multifaceted external shock. First, global crude oil prices skyrocketed, which caused our already bloated import bill to surge almost overnight. Second, the war forced the emergency evacuation of over 100,000 Indian workers from the Gulf region. This meant the crucial remittances they were sending home, the invisible earnings that have been masking the severity of our trade deficit, suddenly evaporated.
So the imports are costing double, and the primary source of foreign exchange income vanishes simultaneously.
Exactly. This rapid deterioration led to a sovereign credit downgrade. International commercial banks completely cut off India's credit lines. We couldn't roll over our short-term debt. The NRI deposits started fleeing the country in a panic.
Wow.
And the foreign exchange reserves plummeted to a mere $1.1 billion, barely enough to cover 2 weeks of essential imports. That is the mathematical anatomy of how you end up pledging 67 tons of gold.
So we approach the IMF and the World Bank, and they don't just hand over a stabilization loan, they impose the Structural Adjustment Program, the SAP. For a master's level evaluation, how should you dissect the conditionalities of this SAP? Because it wasn't just a financial bailout, it was an ideological surrender, wasn't it?
It was the definitive end of the dirigist model. When evaluating the SAP for the exam, you must divide the response into 2 distinct pillars: macroeconomic stabilization and structural reform.
Okay, stabilization first.
Stabilization was immediate crisis management. The IMF demanded a sharp devaluation of the rupee by about 18 to 19% to instantly make exports cheaper and imports more expensive. They also mandated aggressive fiscal contraction, slashing government expenditure and subsidies to cool down domestic demand.
But the stabilization just stops the bleeding. The structural reform is what fundamentally alters the DNA of the economy. This is where the famous LPG, liberalisation, privatisation, globalisation comes in.
Yes, the structural conditionality dismantled the architecture we just discussed. Liberalization meant the immediate abolition of industrial licensing for almost all sectors and the scrapping of the MRTP Act's capacity constraints. Domestic firms were suddenly free to scale. Globalization meant dismantling the quantitative restrictions on imports and drastically slashing peak tariff rates from over 300% down to manageable double digits, while also opening the doors to foreign direct investment.
Okay, so the immediate evaluation is positive. It broke the twin deficit spiral, normalized the balance of payments by 1993, and shifted India onto a much higher growth trajectory. But if you're writing a top-tier exam answer, you have to look at the scars left behind. When you suddenly rip away 40 years of protectionist walls, what happens to the domestic industries that grew up inside that hothouse?
That is the crucial critical evaluation. The SAP successfully stabilized the economy, but many economists argue it induced a degree of premature deindustrialization.
Premature deindustrialization.
Yes, because we slashed tariffs rapidly without simultaneously fixing our domestic infrastructure. Power grids, logistics, ports, domestic manufacturing was suddenly exposed to fierce global competition while still fighting domestic bottlenecks. Many domestic capital goods industries were just decimated. This is why the post-1991 era saw India's growth driven primarily by the services sector, basically bypassing the traditional manufacturing-led development phase that transformed East Asia.
Which perfectly sets up the 2024 IES question on evaluating the roadmap to Viksit Bharat 2047. If we look at the last 30 years since the crisis, we achieved high GDP growth, averaging 6 to 7%, but it's a lopsided growth. You mentioned services bypassing manufacturing. The direct consequence of that is the phrase every development economist dreads: jobless growth.
It is the defining structural challenge of modern India. The IT and services sectors are highly productive and generate massive export revenue, but they are relatively capital and skill intensive. They do not absorb the millions of low to medium skilled workers entering the labor force every year.
Right.
Consequently, we have a massive structural mismatch. Agriculture still employs roughly 45% of the workforce, but contributes only about 18% to the GDP. That implies deeply suppressed productivity and disguised unemployment in the rural economy.
To fix these structural gaps, the institutional architecture of the state itself had to evolve. And the most symbolic shift was the scrapping of the Planning Commission in 2015, replacing it with NIIOG. Now, NIIOG doesn't control 5-year plans, and it doesn't allocate massive central funds to states. If you're writing your answer on NIOG for the 2024 question, the trap is just listing its advisory functions.
Yeah.
What is the actual structural philosophy driving this change?
The examiner's looking for you to evaluate the shift from top-down allocation to competitive federalism. The Planning Commission was a Soviet-style relic. It assumed the center knew best how to allocate capital across a vast, heterogeneous country.
Right.
NEIOG operates on the premise that in a market economy, states shouldn't be lobbying the center for planned funds. They should be competing with each other to attract private capital.
So NEIOG's role is to create the scoreboards, basically. They publish the Export Preparedness Index, the Health Index, the Water Management Index.
Exactly. It forces states to benchmark their governance and infrastructure against their peers. It's a think tank model designed to foster cooperative but highly competitive federalism. The state that digitizes its land records and streamlines its labor compliance wins the FDI. The center acts as a facilitator, not a distributor.
Another massive shift in the state's role is disinvestment, the rollback of the massive public sector footprint created during the Mahalanobis era. We've watched this policy managed by DPAM, the Department of Investment and Public Asset Management, mutate over the decades. How should you critically evaluate the timeline of India's disinvestment?
You really must evaluate it as a transition from mere accounting exercises to genuine structural reform. In the 1990s and early 2000s, disinvestment mostly involved minority stake sales. The government would sell 5% or 10% of a public sector enterprise just to raise quick cash to plug holes in the fiscal deficit.
Yeah.
Sometimes they would even force one public sector company to buy the shares of another, like ONGC buying HPCL.
Which changes absolutely nothing about how the company operates. The state still holds 51%, the bureaucrats still make the decisions, and the inefficiency remains untouched. It's just moving money from the left pocket to the right pocket to make the balance sheet look pretty.
Precisely. It failed to introduce any market discipline. However, if you evaluate the modern new public sector enterprise policy of 2021, the stated objective has explicitly shifted to strategic disinvestment. The privatization of Air India is the gold standard example here.
Walk us through why Air India matters so much for the exam narrative.
Because the goal of selling Air India wasn't primarily to raise fiscal revenue, it was to permanently stop the hemorrhaging of thousands of crores of taxpayer money into a perennial loss-making enterprise. By transferring 100% of the ownership and, crucially, total management control to a private entity, the Tata Group, the state is retreating from non-strategic sectors.
Right.
The evaluation point is that true privatization is about enforcing operational efficiency and market discipline, not just fiscal gap filling.
Which brings us to the grand ambition, the $5 trillion economy target, and the broader vision of Viksit Bharat 2047, aiming for developed nation status by the centenary of independence.
Right.
The framework rests on massive pillars: inclusive growth, sustainable development, innovation, infrastructure. But as economists, we don't just applaud the vision. We evaluate the constraints. What is structurally preventing India from hitting that $5 trillion mark smoothly?
The two most binding constraints are physical logistics friction and the human capital deficit. On logistics, India's cost has historically hovered around 13 to 14% of GDP, whereas global manufacturing powerhouses operate at 7 or 8%.
That's a huge gap.
It is. If it takes 3 days to move a shipping container from a factory in Uttar Pradesh to a port in Maharashtra and costs double what it does in China, your exports are dead on arrival in the global market.
And the human capital constraint.
India has a massive demographic dividend, but a shockingly low percentage of the workforce is formally skilled. You cannot transition a massive agrarian workforce into a high-income, high-tech manufacturing or advanced services economy if they lack foundational skills.
Right.
The risk of Viksit Bharat 2047 is that if these structural constraints aren't solved, the demographic dividend mutates into a demographic liability of unemployable youth.
Okay, we are transitioning seamlessly into our second domain, industry in India. We know the license Raj was dismantled. We stopped dictating capacity limits. But when we look at the industrial structure today, it's highly skewed. We have a few massive conglomerates at the top and millions of tiny informal enterprises at the bottom.
The MSMEs.
Yeah, the MSMEs, micro, small, and medium enterprises. They are the absolute backbone, contributing nearly 30% to GDP and acting as the second largest employer after agriculture. But they suffer from the missing middle syndrome. Why do Indian firms start small and stay small?
Because the regulatory and financial friction increases exponentially as you grow. But the most acute bottleneck for an MSME is the chronic lack of access to formal credit. A massive percentage of MSMEs operate in the informal sector. They don't have audited balance sheets. They don't own prime real estate to offer as collateral.
Right. So imagine you walk into a local bank branch. The bank manager is looking at a small auto parts manufacturer who wants a loan to buy a new CNC machine. The manager sees massive risk. If the manufacturer defaults, the bank can't seize anything of value, so the loan officer demands 150% collateral, which the MSME doesn't have, so the loan is denied. Growth stops.
That is the exact micro-level failure the government is trying to solve with macro-level policy. And the policy you must evaluate here is the CGTMSC, the Credit Guarantee Fund Trust for Micro and Small Enterprises. It fundamentally alters that branch manager's risk calculus.
How does it work mechanically?
Under CGTMSC, the government trust acts as a guarantor for collateral-free loans to MSMEs. If the auto parts manufacturer defaults on that loan, the government trust will reimburse the lending bank for up to 75% or 85% of the default amount.
Okay, wow.
By absorbing the bulk of the risk premium, the state artificially lowers the barrier to credit, allowing the formal banking sector to pump capital into the informal manufacturing base. Add to this the UDM registration portal, which creates a frictionless digital identity for these firms, bringing them into the formal data ecosystem so banks can assess their cash flows.
That addresses the foundation. But here is where the industrial policy gets incredibly aggressive. When we talk about large-scale manufacturing, the flagship initiative driving the Make in India campaign today is the PLI scheme, the Production-Linked Incentive.
Yes.
For a master's student analyzing this, you can't just say PLI gives money to companies. You have to evaluate it as a profound ideological pivot.
It is the most significant pivot in industrial policy since 1991. If you write one thing down for this section, let it be this. The PLI scheme represents a definitive shift from horizontal industrial policy back to vertical industrial policy.
Let's break those terms down because the distinction is everything. Horizontal policy is the classic Washington consensus approach, right?
Yes. Horizontal policy dictates that the state should be sector neutral. The government's job is simply to provide public goods. Build highways, ensure a stable power grid, keep inflation low, digitize tax compliance to improve the ease of doing business, and then step away. Let the invisible hand of the free market decide whether India's comparative advantage lies in making t-shirts, software, or pharmaceuticals. The state explicitly refuses to pick winners.
But PLI violently throws that neutrality out the window. I mean, it is explicitly picking winners.
Exactly. PLI is highly targeted vertical industrial policy. The government analyzed the global trade landscape and explicitly selected 14 champion sectors like electronics manufacturing, active pharmaceutical ingredients, solar modules, and advanced chemistry cell batteries. The state is stepping in and offering direct, massive financial incentives, often 4% to 6% of incremental sales, to companies that manufacture these specific goods on Indian soil.
Wait, I want to challenge this. How is this not just the license rise in reverse? In the 70s, the state picked winners by handing out exclusive licenses to produce. Today, the state is picking winners by handing out massive checks to produce. Isn't this just a return to state-directed distortion of the free market?
That is a brilliant structural critique and exactly how you should frame your exam answer. It is absolutely a return to state-directed industrial policy. However, the mechanism is entirely different.
How so?
The license Raj was restriction-based and focused on inward-looking domestic monopolies. The PLI scheme is incentive-based, and it is ruthlessly focused on global scale and export competitiveness. It is modeled heavily on the East Asian developmental state, what South Korea did to build its J-balls or what Taiwan did to dominate semiconductors.
Right.
The Indian state recognizes that you cannot organically break into deeply entrenched global value chains like the Apple supply chain just by building a better road. You have to brute force your way in by artificially lowering the cost of production until the ecosystem takes root.
Let's look at that Apple supply chain example. It's touted as the massive success story of the electronics PLI. We see Foxconn and Wistron setting up massive assembly plants in Tamil Nadu and Karnataka. iPhone exports are surging. But if we aggressively evaluate this, what is the catch? What is the vulnerability in this PLI success?
The vulnerability is the distinction between gross assembly and domestic value addition. The PLI scheme has successfully incentivized the final assembly of iPhones in India. But a smartphone is made of thousands of high-tech components: memory chips, OLED screens, precision camera modules. Currently, the vast majority of these high-value components are still imported, predominantly from China, and merely screwed together in India. So while our gross export numbers look incredible, the actual domestic value addition is arguably quite low, hovering around 15 to 20%.
So we are paying subsidies to boost assembly, which paradoxically forces us to import more components.
Yes, initially. The policy gamble is that by creating massive final assembly scale first, you create a gravitational pull. The hope is that the component manufacturers will eventually be forced to relocate to India to be closer to the Foxconn assembly lines, deepening the ecosystem and driving value addition up to 40% or 50% over the next decade, but that is not guaranteed.
Especially because, despite PLI, despite cutting corporate tax rates to 15% for new manufacturing units, India's manufacturing share of GDP has stubbornly stagnated around 16 to 70% for decades.
True.
The national manufacturing policy aimed for 25%. We aren't hitting it. Why? If we are throwing billions of dollars at these firms, what is the physical anchor dragging them down?
It brings us right back to physical friction and infrastructure. A 5% PLI subsidy is completely neutralized if your logistics costs are 6% higher than your competitors in Vietnam. Furthermore, consider industrial power tariffs. In India, to heavily subsidize electricity for the agricultural sector and rural households, state electricity boards drastically overcharge industrial and commercial consumers.
Right.
This cross-subsidization makes the baseline cost of running a factory in India structurally uncompetitive globally.
So the state is subsidizing them with PLI on one end and penalizing them with exorbitant power and transport costs on the other. How is the government trying to untangle this infrastructure knot?
This is where you evaluate PM Gati Shakti and the National Infrastructure Pipeline, the NIP. Historically, Indian infrastructure was built in isolated silos. The Highway Ministry builds a road, and 6 months later, the Telecom Ministry digs it up to lay fiber optic cables, destroying the road and delaying freight.
Typical.
Yeah. PM Gati Shakti is a massive GIS-based digital platform that forces 16 disparate ministries to integrate their planning. It's an attempt to eradicate bureaucratic friction in infrastructure execution. The NIP is the capital backing it up. A pipeline of over 111 lakh crore rupees aimed at building multimodal logistics parks and dedicated freight corridors to permanently compress those logistics costs.
And historically, another tool we used to bypass domestic infrastructure nightmares was the creation of special economic zones, SEZs. Think of an SEZ like a walled garden. The government says, look, we can't fix the roads and the red tape in the whole country, but inside these specific 500 acres, the power won't fail, the customs clearances are instant, and your export profits are tax-free. From an exam perspective, how do you evaluate the legacy of SEZs in India?
You must evaluate SEZs as a mixed success that fell short of their Chinese inspirations. They undeniably drove a massive surge in India's export growth, particularly in IT and IT-enabled services. Parks in Hyderabad and Bangalore became global hubs, but their impact on physical, hard manufacturing was highly underwhelming.
Why? Why did software thrive in SEZs while manufacturing stagnated?
Because an IT firm just needs reliable broadband and backup generators. A manufacturing firm needs deep linkages with the domestic economy. It needs to truck raw materials in and out of the zone constantly. The poor infrastructure outside the SEZ walls negated the benefits inside.
Makes sense.
Furthermore, there was immense controversy around the tax holidays. When the government introduced the Minimum Alternate Tax, or MAT-C, and initiated a sunset clause to phase out direct tax exemptions for SEZs, a massive amount of corporate interest vanished overnight.
Which implies they were never there for the agglomeration benefits or the infrastructure. They were just there for the tax arbitrage.
Exactly. It revealed a structural weakness. However, the global landscape is shifting dramatically right now, offering India a rare geopolitical tailwind. The disruptions of the pandemic, coupled with rising U.S.-China trade tensions, have exposed the massive vulnerability of highly concentrated global value chains.
The famous China Plus One strategy. Multinational corporations are terrified of having 90% of their production capacity locked inside a country that might face sudden tariffs or geopolitical sanctions.
Yes. Boardrooms globally are demanding supply chain diversification. India is aggressively pitching itself as the ultimate plus-one destination, leveraging its massive domestic market, its PLI incentives, and its demographic dividend. But the structural evaluation remains. To truly capture this shift, India needs foreign direct investment in hard manufacturing, not just in global capability centers and services.
And that pivot from domestic manufacturing to global supply chains forces us to look at how we interact with the rest of the world. Let's move into our third domain, foreign trade in India and WTO obligations. Let's start with a diagnostic scan of India's current trade structure. What exactly are we buying and selling in the global marketplace today compared to the Mahalanobis era?
Well, the composition of our merchandise exports has undergone a profound structural transformation. We have pivoted away from being a primary commodity exporter shipping out raw ores, tea, and basic textiles. Today, our export basket is dominated by highly complex value-added goods. We export refined petroleum products, despite importing the crude massive quantities of pharmaceutical formulations and complex engineering goods like auto components and heavy machinery. And as we discussed with the PLI scheme, electronics and smartphones are now surging up the export charts.
But the absolute behemoth of our external sector isn't physical goods at all. It's the services sector. We have to talk about the IT engine.
It is the defining feature of India's external economy. India runs a massive structural surplus in services trade, primarily driven by software services, business process outsourcing, and the rapid rise of global capability centers, where multinationals offshore complex R&D and financial analysis to Indian talent.
Yeah.
To put numbers on it, in recent fiscal years, our service exports have crossed the $340 billion mark. This services-led export model makes India an absolute anomaly among developing nations, which usually rely on low-cost manufacturing.
And the geography of our trade is shifting too. Historically, it was all about the U.S. and the European Union.
The U.S. and EU remain our most critical export destinations, especially for high-value services and pharma. But the definitive trend is the pivot toward the global south. We are deepening trade integration with ASEAN nations, exploring new markets in Africa, and critically, the Middle East.
Right, like the UAE deal.
Exactly. The recent signing of the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, CEPA, with the UAE is a prime example of strategically securing trade corridors that offer tariff reductions and easier visa norms for Indian professionals. However, the glaring strategic vulnerability remains our profound import dependency on China.
Right. We might be exporting iPhones, but we are importing the capital goods, the active pharmaceutical ingredients, and the electronics components from China to make everything else. Which brings us to the core macroeconomic vulnerability of the Indian economy. Even with this incredible $340 billion services export machine and billions more in remittances from Indians working in the Gulf and the U.S., our overall current account deficit, the CAD, is constantly under pressure. Why is our merchandise trade deficit so stubbornly, inelastically high?
Because our import bill is dominated by absolute structural necessities that are highly inelastic to price. Look at the balance sheet. Roughly 80 to 85% of India's crude oil requirement is imported.
Right.
Oil alone constitutes a terrifyingly large chunk of our import bill. We don't import oil because it's cheap. We import it because the economy literally stops without it.
And then there's our cultural obsession.
Gold. India imports massive quantities of physical gold, draining billions in foreign exchange, largely to serve as a traditional store of value and for the jewelry sector.
So mechanically, if the geopolitical situation in the Middle East deteriorates and global Brent crude prices spike from $70 to $100 a barrel, India's current account deficit violently widens, regardless of how many software packages we sold that month.
Precisely. We rely on the massive services surplus and the remittance inflows to continually bail out the massive merchandise deficit. Without IT and the diaspora, India would face a Bo Peep crisis every few years. It is a highly precarious structural balance.
And the shock absorber that manages this precarious balance is the currency. Let's talk about the rupee and India's exchange rate management. Now, a strict boundary rule for us here. We are not discussing domestic monetary policy or inflation targeting. We are evaluating exchange rates purely through the lens of trade competitiveness. How does the Reserve Bank of India actually manage the value of the rupee against the dollar?
India officially operates under a managed float exchange rate regime. This means the baseline value of the rupee is determined by global market forces, the daily supply and demand for dollars versus rupees, based on trade flows and capital investments. The state does not decree that $1 equals 80 rupees. However, the float is heavily managed.
Explain the mechanics of that management.
Yeah.
The RBI doesn't just watch the market, it actively intervenes.
The RBI maintains massive foreign exchange reserves, often exceeding $600 billion. It uses this war chest to actively intervene in the currency markets. If sudden foreign portfolio capital flight causes the rupee to crash rapidly, making our oil imports devastatingly expensive overnight, the RBI will sell billions of dollars from its reserves into the open market. This artificially increases the supply of dollars, absorbing the panic and stabilizing the rupee.
Right.
Conversely, if massive foreign investment floods in, causing the rupee to appreciate too quickly, which would make our exports uncompetitive, the RBI buys dollars, adding them to the reserves.
So they aren't trying to reverse the tide. They are just building breakwaters to prevent the waves from destroying the port. They smooth out the volatility.
Exactly. Now, for the exam, you cannot just discuss the nominal exchange rate like 83 rupees to a dollar. That only tells you the bilateral relationship. To evaluate true trade competitiveness, economists look at the near and the rear.
Walk us through these indices. What is the nominal effective exchange rate, the near?
The NER is an index. It measures the value of the rupee against a weighted basket of currencies of India's major trading partners, not just the US dollar, but the euro, the yen, the yuan. It gives a broader picture of the currency's nominal strength.
But nominal is just the surface. The real effective exchange rate, the REER, is what matters for trade flows. How is REER calculated and why is it crucial?
The REER takes the NER and adjusts it for inflation differentials between India and its trading partners. This is a vital mechanism to understand.
Yeah.
Suppose India's inflation rate is 6% and the US inflation rate is 2%. That means the cost of manufacturing a good in India is rising much faster than in the US. If the nominal exchange rate, the rupee-dollar rate, remains perfectly stable, India's exports are becoming structurally more expensive and uncompetitive in real terms.
Because the foreign buyer is paying the same exchange rate, but the actual price tag on the Indian good has gone up due to domestic inflation.
Precisely. In that scenario, the REER index goes up, indicating that the rupee has become overvalued in real terms. To maintain export competitiveness, the nominal exchange rate actually needs to depreciate to offset the higher domestic inflation. If the REER is consistently above 100, it signals a loss of trade competitiveness, worsening the merchandise deficit.
This brings us to a fascinating, highly relevant development. The IMF recently released a report where they changed how they classify India's exchange rate regime. They downgraded or reclassified it from a stabilized arrangement to a crawl-like arrangement. What does that terminology actually mean? It sounds like we're moving slower.
It's an observation based on statistical behavior, not a stated policy change by the RBI. A stabilized arrangement implied that the RBI was intervening so heavily that the rupee was kept within a very tight, almost artificially rigid band against the dollar. By reclassifying it to a crawl-like arrangement, the IMF is observing that the rupee is indeed moving directionally, usually experiencing a gradual managed depreciation against the dollar to offset inflation, but it is remaining within a very narrow margin against a statistical trend line over time.
So the IMF is basically saying, we see what you're doing. You're letting the market dictate the long-term trend, but the RBI's interventions are so precise that the currency crawls steadily along that trend rather than experiencing sharp market jumps.
Exactly. It highlights the immense operational success of the RBI in preventing imported inflation via currency crashes, while slowly allowing the depreciation needed to keep exports competitive.
Okay, navigating the currency markets is one thing, but navigating international trade law is another beast entirely. Let's delve into India's complex, often combative relationship with the World Trade Organization, the WTO. It is a constant tightrope walk between fulfilling global integration commitments and deploying strategic protectionism. Let's start with the basics of goods trade, tariffs.
In WTO architecture, there is a fundamental distinction between bound tariff rates and applied tariff rates. When India joined the WTO, it had to negotiate and commit to bound rates for thousands of product lines. A bound rate is the absolute legal maximum tariff a country promises it will not exceed. The applied rate is the actual tariff the customs officer charges at the border on any given day.
I like to think of bound tariffs like the maximum depth a military submarine is engineered to dive to before the hull crushes. The applied tariff is the depth the submarine is currently cruising at.
That is an excellent mechanical analogy. India has historically negotiated extremely high bound rates, especially for agricultural commodities, often binding them at 100% or even 150%. However, our applied rates are much lower. The average applied tariff for industrial goods is around 13 to 15%.
So there's a massive gap between the cruising depth and the crush depth. Why leave that gap? Why not just bind the tariffs at the lower rate to signal total free trade?
Because that gap, which trade economists call water in the tariff, is the sovereign tactical maneuvering room. It gives the Indian government the flexibility to suddenly hike import duties if a domestic sector is suddenly threatened by a surge of cheap, dumped imports from overseas without violating its WTO commitments.
I see.
If China suddenly floods the market with cheap steel, India can immediately raise the applied tariff on steel from 15% to 40% because the bound rate is sitting safely at 60%. It is a strategic buffer for domestic industry.
Smart. But while industrial tariffs are manageable, the real fireworks, the absolute highest tension at the WTO, always involve agriculture.
The Agreement on Agriculture, or AOA, is the battleground. The WTO framework categorizes domestic agricultural subsidies into conceptual boxes based on how much they distort global trade. The most contentious is the amber box. These are trade-distorting subsidies policies that directly influence how much a farmer produces or the price they receive, which distorts global commodity prices.
And India's entire food security architecture rests in this box, right? The Minimum Support Price MSP program, where the government guarantees a floor price for wheat and rice, and the massive fertilizer subsidies.
Yes, and the WTO imposes strict mathematical limits on amber box subsidies. For a developing country like India, the rule is the de minimis limit. Total trade distorting sport cannot exceed 10% of the total value of agricultural production.
And India frequently breaches this limit, or comes dangerously close, triggering massive disputes with developed nations like the US and Canada, who accuse us of unfairly subsidizing our farmers. But India's defense reveals a massive structural flaw in the WTO's math. Walk us through why India argues the 10% rule is rigged.
This is a critical evaluation point for the exam. To calculate whether a country has breached the 10% limit, you have to measure the subsidy. The WTO formula measures the subsidy by comparing the current minimum support price given to farmers against a fixed external reference price. The outrage is that the WTO rules mandate using the average global prices from the years 1986 to 1988 as the fixed reference point.
Wait, so they are comparing the rupees paid to an Indian farmer in 2024 against the global price of wheat from 1986. That ignores almost 40 years of inflation.
Exactly. Because of decades of inflation, the current MSP naturally looks astronomically higher than the 1986 reference price. This statistical anomaly mathematically inflates the calculated subsidy, pushing India over the 10% limit. India fiercely defends its MSP and public stockholding programs as an absolute sovereign imperative to feed hundreds of millions of people, arguing that the WTO rules are structurally biased against the realities of developing nations. This fight led to the invocation of the Peace Clause at the Bali Ministerial, which temporarily shields India from legal disputes over these breaches while a permanent solution is negotiated.
So what is the long-term structural solution? How does India support farmer incomes without triggering a WTO trade war?
By strategically migrating its support from the contentious amber box into the compliant green box. Green box subsidies are defined as those that do not distort trade or cause minimal distortion. They must be government-funded, not involve price support, and crucially, they must be decoupled from production levels.
Meaning the farmer gets the money regardless of whether they grow 10 tons of rice, 1 ton of rice, or no rice at all. It doesn't incentivize overproduction.
Exactly. Investments in agricultural research, rural infrastructure, pest control, and decoupled direct income support all fall into the green box. The PM Kisan scheme in India, where landholding farmers receive a flat, unconditional cash transfer of 6,000 rupees a year, is a textbook example of a green box policy.
Right.
It provides a vital safety net for the farmer's livelihood without mathematically distorting global commodity prices. The grand policy challenge for India is executing a structural transition of its massive subsidy budget out of the amber box like MSP and fertilizers and into the green box like PM Kisan and capital infrastructure.
Okay, beyond the fierce battles over agriculture, there are two other major WTO agreements that are highly relevant to India's specific economic makeup: TRIPS and GATS. Let's start with TRIPS, the agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. India has a very unique, often adversarial position here, particularly concerning the pharmaceutical sector.
India is universally recognized as the pharmacy of the developing world. We have a massive, highly competitive generic drug industry that supplies cheap, life-saving medicines globally. Before joining the WTO, India's patent laws only recognized process patents. This meant an Indian company could reverse engineer a Western drug, invent a slightly different manufacturing process, and legally sell it for a fraction of the price.
Which is how the generic industry was built, but TRIPS outlawed that.
Yes. Under TRIPS commitments, India was forced to transition to a full product patent regime by 2005. This meant recognizing the Western multinational's monopoly patent on the drug molecule itself, regardless of how it was manufactured.
Which massive pharmaceutical companies in the West obviously celebrated, but it fundamentally threatened the survival of the Indian generic industry and, more importantly, the supply of affordable medicines to the global South. How did India structurally respond to this mandate while protecting its interests?
The exam evaluation here relies on how India aggressively utilized the legal flexibilities built into the TRIPS agreement. The most famous example is Section 3 of the amended Indian Patents Act. This section was specifically drafted to prevent evergreening.
Evergreening.
Yes, evergreening is a tactic where a multinational pharma company makes a trivial, structurally insignificant change to a drug like changing a powder to a tablet or altering a salt form just before the original patent expires in order to secure a fresh 20-year monopoly. Section 3 strictly prohibits patenting new forms of known substances unless they demonstrate significantly enhanced therapeutic efficacy.
And this wasn't just theoretical law. It led to one of the most famous patent battles in history, the Novartis case.
Absolutely crucial for the exam. The Swiss multinational Novartis tried to patent a slightly altered crystal form of their blockbuster cancer drug, Gleevec. The Indian Patent Office rejected it under Section 3B. Novartis took it all the way to the Indian Supreme Court, arguing it violated TRIPS. The Supreme Court upheld the rejection, ruling that the new form did not cure cancer any better than the old form.
Wow.
This decision legally protected the generic production of the drug, dropping the cost of a month's treatment from thousands of dollars to roughly $200.
That is a phenomenal example of using legal architecture to protect strategic interests. But India went even further with another TRIPS flexibility: compulsory licensing. This is the nuclear option of patent law, isn't it?
It is a profound sovereign power. Under TRIPS, in cases of extreme national emergency, public health crises, or if a patent holder is pricing a life-saving drug exorbitantly out of reach of the public, a sovereign government can issue a compulsory license. This essentially overrides the monopoly. The government legally authorizes a domestic generic manufacturer to produce the patented drug without the consent of the multinational patent holder, paying them a nominal royalty instead.
And India famously pulled this trigger.
Yes. In 2012, involving the multinational Bayer and their kidney cancer drug Nexivar. Bayer was charging over $5,000 for a month's supply in India, an astronomical sum. The Indian government granted a compulsory license to the domestic generic firm Natco Pharma, which began producing the exact same drug for roughly $175 a month. It is the ultimate evaluation point on how a developing nation balances stringent international intellectual property obligations against the fundamental human right to public health.
Brilliant. Okay, finally, we must address GATS, the General Agreement on Trade and Services. Given that we just discussed India's staggering $340 billion services export engine, this agreement is arguably our most vital offensive interest at the WTO.
Without question. The GATS framework categorizes international trade and services into 4 distinct modes of supply. Mode 1 is cross-border supply. This is your classic Bangalore software developer writing code that is transmitted over the internet to a server in a New York bank. India dominates Mode 1 globally. Mode 2 is consumption abroad, like a German tourist visiting Kerala or an American patient getting medical treatment in Chennai. Mode 3 is commercial presence, where an Indian bank opens a physical branch in London.
But the real friction, and where India spends all its negotiating capital, is Mode 4.
Mode 4 is defined as the movement of natural persons. It covers the temporary migration of highly skilled professionals, software engineers, doctors, specialized consultants, traveling to a foreign country to deliver a service on-site. India's primary offensive strategy in almost all bilateral free trade agreements and WTO rounds is demanding that developed nations liberalize their restrictive visa regimes, like the H-1B in the US or similar visas in the EU, to facilitate Mode 4 commitments.
Because if you have the largest pool of young, skilled STEM talent in the world, your competitive advantage is useless if they can't cross borders to deploy those skills.
Exactly. Pushing for Mode 4 liberalization is the structural mechanism required to truly leverage India's demographic dividend on the global stage.
Okay, let's take a deep breath. We have covered an immense amount of macroeconomic ground today. We traced the mathematical logic and the bureaucratic friction of the Mahalanobis model and the license Raj. We dissected the twin deficit spiral that triggered the 1991 gold airlift and evaluated the structural scars left by the IMF stabilization program. We looked at Niti Aayog's competitive federalism and the privatization of Air India. We dove into the branch-level mechanics of MSME credit guarantees and debated whether the PLI scheme is a brilliant East Asian masterstroke or a return-to-state distortion. And finally, we navigated the structural deficit of our trade balance, the RBI's managed float, and the intense legal warfare of WTO tariffs, agricultural subsidies, and TRIPS compulsory licenses.
It's a lot.
It is a lot. So, After all that synthesis, what does this actually mean for you, the student sitting in the exam hall staring at the GE-04 paper 4?
It means you must elevate your answers above simple descriptions. You have the mechanics, now you must apply the analysis. To give you a strategic edge based on analyzing the recent trends of the IES board, here are the 3 most highly probable exam patterns you should rigorously prepare for in 2026.
Give us the roadmap.
Pattern number 1. The 1991 crisis causes and the structural adjustment outcomes. Do not just list the Gulf War as the cause, you must explain the underlying fiscal profligacy and the twin deficit spiral that made the economy fragile. Then, expect a question asking you to critically evaluate the long-term outcomes of the SAP. Did it merely cure the BOP crisis by slashing tariffs? Or did it induce premature deindustrialization that led to the jobless, service-led growth we suffer from today? Be ready to contrast the short-term macroeconomic stabilization with the long-term structural gaps.
Right, did we just stop the bleeding, or did we actually fix the internal organs?
Precisely. Pattern number 2. A deep evaluation of the PLI scheme. You must be ready to dissect its design. Explicitly contrast its vertical sector-picking nature with the horizontal neutral policies of the 1990s. Detail its sectoral coverage, particularly the dynamics of value addition versus gross assembly in electronics and pharma, and critically assess its realistic impact. Will PLI alone finally push manufacturing share of GDP beyond that stubborn 17%? You must bring in the structural constraints, logistics costs, power tariffs, and initiatives like PM Gati Shakti to argue that financial incentives alone cannot overcome physical infrastructure friction.
And the final pattern.
Pattern number 3. India's strategic defense of its WTO obligations. Prepare for a deep dive into the structural tensions between domestic needs and global rules. You might get a question on TRIPS, specifically Section 3D, and the use of compulsory licensing in the pharmaceutical sector, evaluating how India balances the defense of global public health against intellectual property monopolies. Or, highly likely, you will face a question on the fierce debate over agricultural subsidies. Be ready to explain the flawed math of the 10% amber box limit using 1986 reference prices, and evaluate India's necessary policy transition toward green box decoupled support, like the PM Kisan scheme, to secure sovereign food security.
That is an incredibly robust analytical roadmap for your revision. You now have the underlying mechanisms to write truly exceptional answers. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought, a paradox that bridges everything we've discussed today.
Here is the defining macroeconomic tension for the vision of Viksit Bharat 2047. The Indian state is simultaneously aggressively pursuing Atmanirbhar Bharat, which is the doctrine of national self-reliance, while desperately trying to deeply integrate into highly globalized supply chains as the ultimate China plus one alternative.
Self-reliance on one hand, global dependency on the other. It sounds entirely contradictory.
That is exactly the macroeconomic puzzle. Can a nation successfully execute strategic targeted protectionism subsidizing domestic champions via PLI, occasionally raising tariff walls on imported components to force localized production, while simultaneously attempting to be an open, frictionless, export-led powerhouse? The historical X-ray of the Mahalanobis era proves that inward-looking protectionist policies inevitably breed crippling inefficiency. Yet, the post-1991 era proves that total, sudden openness without domestic manufacturing capability leaves you structurally hollowed out and dangerously vulnerable to global shocks, as we see with our massive import reliance on critical electronics and active pharmaceutical ingredients. Reconciling those two diametrically opposed forces, domestic strategic protection and seamless global integration, is the ultimate policy tightrope. How India walks that line will determine the economic reality of 2047.
Which brings us right back to the complex, deeply fascinating mechanics of structural policy. We aren't just looking at isolated schemes or historical dates. We are looking at the dynamic, evolving, and sometimes profoundly contradictory architecture of an economy in transition. Good luck on your GE-04 revision. You have the theoretical tools, you have the historical context, and you understand the underlying mechanisms. Now go aggressively evaluate those policies on paper. Keep challenging the assumptions and keep diving deep.